In the annals of warfare, some moments are remembered for their grand battles and sweeping victories. Others are forgotten, buried beneath layers of classified documents and fading memories. But, occasionally, a single bullet fired through a raging blizzard can change the course of history itself. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose name you've never heard, whose face never graced magazine covers, but whose impossible shot on a frozen mountainside in Eastern Europe turned the tide of a conflict that could have consumed the world. What makes a shot impossible? Is it the distance, perhaps a mile through swirling snow? The target, maybe a man no bigger than a shadow moving between trees? Or is it the stakes, knowing that missing means watching thousands of innocent people die while the world slides toward nuclear war? For Elena Rodriguez, crouched behind her rifle on that bitter February morning in 2019, it was all three. And, somehow, against every law of physics and probability, she made it count. This is not a story about heroism as Hollywood portrays it. There are no dramatic speeches, no flags waving in slow motion, no orchestral music swelling at the moment of triumph. This is a story about a young woman from a small Texas town who found herself holding the world's fate in her trembling, frost-bitten hands, and who pulled the trigger when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The shot that changed everything lasted less than 3 seconds from muzzle flash to impact. But, the story of how Elena Rodriguez came to be in that position, why that one bullet mattered so much, and what happened in the aftermath would take years to fully understand. Even now, most of the details remain classified, the participants scattered or silent, the true scope of what almost happened known only to a handful of people who will never speak publicly about that winter day when the world stood on the precipice of unthinkable catastrophe. But, some stories demand to be told, regardless of classification levels or official silence. Some truths are too important to remain buried in government files and fading memories. This is one of those stories. Elena Rodriguez never intended to become a sniper. Growing up in the dusty town of Marfa, Texas, population 1,800, her biggest concerns were helping her father run his struggling auto repair shop and figuring out how to pay for college. The closest she'd come to military service was watching her older brother Miguel ship out to Afghanistan when she was 16. When he came home 2 years later, quieter and thinner, with shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before, Elena swore she'd never follow that path. But, life has a way of making liars of us all. When her father's heart attack left the family drowning in medical debt, and the auto shop went under 6 months later, Elena found herself staring at a recruiter's business card Miguel had left on the kitchen table. "Think about it," he'd said. "The army taught me discipline, skills. It can give you a future when everything else falls apart." The future Elena envisioned didn't include crawling through mud or learning to kill people. She wanted to study computer science, maybe work for one of those tech companies in Austin. But, with her father unable to work and her mother cleaning houses for minimum wage just to keep food on the table, college felt like a luxury from another world. So on a gray December morning in 2014, 3 months after her 18th birthday, Elena walked into the recruitment office in El Paso and signed her name on papers that would change everything. Basic training at Fort Benning was exactly as miserable as Miguel had warned her it would be. The Georgia heat was oppressive, the drill sergeants were merciless, and Elena spent most nights wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She wasn't the strongest recruit or the fastest runner, but she had something that set her apart from the others, an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure and an uncanny talent for marksmanship that surprised everyone, including herself. It started during week 3 of basic, when Drill Sergeant Morrison lined up the entire company for their first real weapons training. Elena had shot her grandfather's old hunting rifle a few times as a kid, but nothing had prepared her for the weight and precision of an M16. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 300 yards, Elena's shots grouped so tightly that Morrison initially suspected equipment malfunction. "Rodriguez," he barked after examining her target through binoculars. "You been practicing on your own time?" "No, Drill Sergeant," Elena replied, genuinely confused by the attention. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then, made a note in his logbook. That note would eventually make its way up the chain of command, flagging Elena Rodriguez as a candidate for specialized training. After basic training and advanced individual training in military intelligence, Elena expected to spend her enlistment behind a desk, analyzing satellite imagery or monitoring communications. The Army had other plans. In early 2016, she received orders to report to Fort Bragg for Scout Sniper School, an intensive program that would push her physical and mental limits beyond anything she'd experienced. The statistics were daunting. Of the 42 soldiers who began the course with Elena, only 12 would graduate. The curriculum covered everything from advanced marksmanship and ballistics to camouflage and stealth movement. Students learned to calculate wind speed and direction, humidity, temperature, and even the Coriolis effect, the way Earth's rotation could influence a bullet's trajectory over extreme distances. Elena excelled at the technical aspects of sniping. She had a mathematician's mind for calculating variables and a surgeon's steady hands for making precise adjustments. But it was the psychological component that nearly broke her. Learning to kill another human being from a distance, to watch through a scope as a target went about their daily routine, and, then, to squeeze the trigger at the precise moment when that person became a mission objective rather than a living, breathing individual, that transformation required a fundamental rewiring of everything Elena believed about herself and the world. The instructors at Fort Bragg were frank about what they were creating. "You're not soldiers in the traditional sense," Sergeant Major Thompson told the remaining candidates during Week 8. "You're problem solvers. When diplomacy fails and conventional tactics won't work, you become the last option before everything goes to hell. The difference between you and regular infantry is that when you pull the trigger, it usually means someone very important dies, or someone very important lives. That kind of responsibility will either make you or destroy you." Elena graduated third in her class in September 2016. Her final test involved a 1,200-yard shot in variable wind conditions, hitting a target no bigger than a dinner plate while hidden in dense forest cover. She made the shot on her first attempt, earning praise from instructors who rarely acknowledged excellence. Her first deployment was to Syria, where Elena spent 8 months as part of a joint Special Operations Command unit hunting high-value targets. The work was dangerous and morally complex, but it felt like traditional warfare: clear objectives, identifiable enemies, measurable success. She performed well enough to earn a commendation and recommendation for advanced training. It was during her second deployment, to the Horn of Africa in 2017, that Elena first encountered the shadowy world of international intelligence operations. Her unit was tasked with providing overwatch for CIA operatives working to destabilize a weapons trafficking network. The mission required weeks of patient observation, gathering intelligence on movement patterns and identifying key players in an organization that seemed to shift and adapt like smoke. Elena's spotter during that deployment was Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, a veteran of 3 tours who'd seen enough combat to develop a philosophical approach to the work they did. During long hours of surveillance, he'd share stories about the interconnected nature of global conflicts, how a weapons dealer in Somalia might supply guerrillas in South America, who in turn funded terrorists in Europe. "The world's smaller than most people think," Chen told her during one particularly quiet night watching a compound suspected of housing arms dealers. "A butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing, and 6 months later there's a revolution in Madagascar. What we do here, taking out one weapon supplier, might prevent a war somewhere else that nobody will ever hear about." Elena found Chen's perspective both fascinating and troubling. The idea that her actions could have consequences rippling across continents and years made every decision feel heavier. When she finally took her first confirmed kill, a terrorist financier who'd been coordinating attacks across East Africa, Elena felt a strange mixture of professional satisfaction and personal emptiness. The shot itself had been technically straightforward, a 800-yard engagement in clear weather conditions. But, as Elena watched through her scope, seeing the target collapse and the chaos that followed, she understood that she'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. She was no longer Elena Rodriguez from Marfa, Texas, dreaming of college and a normal life. She was something harder and more focused, shaped by training and experience into a weapon pointed at the world's darkest corners. Her performance in Africa earned Elena a promotion to staff sergeant and selection for an elite program she'd never heard of. The invitation came through official channels but was deliberately vague, mentioning only special assignment and advanced training opportunity. When Elena reported to the designated location, a nondescript office building in Virginia, she found herself in a world where nothing was quite what it seemed. The program, she learned, was designed to prepare military specialists for operations that existed in the gray areas between traditional warfare and intelligence work. Students came from various branches of the military and intelligence community, united only by exceptional skills and absolute security clearance. The training covered everything from foreign languages and cultural immersion to advanced surveillance techniques and what instructors euphemistically called problem resolution. Elena spent 6 months in the program, learning to operate independently in hostile environments, to blend into foreign populations, and to make decisions without backup or oversight. The psychological training was particularly intensive, designed to prepare operatives for situations where the normal rules of engagement didn't apply and where success might require actions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. By early 2018, Elena Rodriguez had become someone her teenage self wouldn't recognize. She was fluent in 3 languages, qualified with a dozen different weapon systems, and capable of disappearing into a crowd or surviving alone in wilderness for weeks. More importantly, she developed the mental discipline necessary to function effectively in situations where hesitation meant death and where the difference between success and failure often came down to a single decision made in a fraction of a second. None of this preparation, however, could have readied her for what was coming. In November 2018, Elena received orders that would take her to Eastern Europe, to a conflict that wasn't supposed to exist and a mission that would test every skill she'd learned and every principle she'd abandoned along the way. The briefing was held in a secure conference room buried 3 floors beneath the Pentagon. Elena was one of 12 operatives selected for what the briefers called Operation Silent Thunder. The mission parameters were unlike anything she'd encountered before. A rogue intelligence cell had seized control of several nuclear warheads during the chaos following a failed coup attempt in a former Soviet republic. The weapons were being moved through mountainous terrain toward buyers who intended to use them against civilian populations in Western Europe. Conventional military response was impossible due to the political situation and the risk of the weapons being detonated in populated areas. Diplomatic solutions had been exhausted. The only option remaining was a series of precision strikes designed to eliminate key personnel and recover or destroy the weapons before they could be deployed. Elena's role would be to provide overwatch for a recovery team attempting to secure the weapons during a planned transfer. Intelligence suggested the exchange would take place in a remote mountain facility during a narrow window when the weapons would be vulnerable. Her job was to eliminate any threats that might prevent the recovery team from completing their mission. The briefing officer, a colonel whose name Elena never learned, was brutally honest about the stakes involved. If this operation fails, we estimate between 50,000 and 200,000 civilians will die in the initial attacks. The international response will likely trigger a larger conflict that could escalate rapidly. Your role, Sergeant Rodriguez, is to ensure that doesn't happen. As Elena left the briefing, she understood that she was about to embark on a mission where failure meant not just her own death, but potentially the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The weight of that responsibility was almost paralyzing, but it was also clarifying. Everything she'd trained for, every skill she'd developed, every moral compromise she'd made had led to this moment. The flight to Eastern Europe took 18 hours across 3 different aircraft, each leg designed to obscure Elena's final destination and purpose. By the time she arrived at the forward operating base, winter had already begun to grip the mountains with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow falling almost constantly. Elena's final briefing took place in a converted shipping container that served as the mission command center. The target area was a former Soviet research facility buried deep in a mountain range that straddled the border between two countries still locked in a frozen conflict from decades past. Intelligence indicated that the weapon transfer would occur during a 3-day window when weather conditions would provide cover from satellite surveillance. The challenge was distance and conditions. Elena would need to position herself nearly 2 miles from the target facility, on an exposed ridge that would provide the necessary line of sight. The shot, if it came, would be through weather conditions that made accurate marksmanship nearly impossible. Wind speeds were forecast to reach 40 miles per hour, with heavy snow reducing visibility to less than 100 yards at times. The probability of success is low, admitted Major Sarah Patterson, the mission commander. But, you're the best we have, and this is the only option we have left. Elena spent her final night at the forward operating base cleaning her rifle, a custom-built system that represented the pinnacle of military precision engineering. The weapon was chambered for .338 Lapua Magnum, a cartridge designed specifically for extreme long-range accuracy. Every component had been manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and Elena had personally zeroed the scope using ammunition matched to her exact specifications. As she worked, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a small Texas town to the mountains of Eastern Europe, from a teenage girl worried about college tuition to a professional killer preparing for a shot that might determine the fate of nations. The transformation still surprised her sometimes, how completely she'd become someone she'd never imagined being. But, there was no time for second-guessing or regret. In 12 hours, Elena would begin her movement toward the ridge where everything would be decided. The world was counting on her, even though the world would never know her name or understand what she'd done. That anonymity, she'd learned, was the price of being effective in the shadows where real decisions got made. The last entry in Elena's mission journal, written before she departed for the target area, captured the strange mixture of confidence and uncertainty that defined her mindset. 2 miles, variable wind, 0 visibility. Impossible shot under impossible conditions. But, impossible is just another word for something nobody's done yet. The climb to the ridge began at 0300 hours in absolute darkness, with Elena carrying 60 pounds of equipment through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer in daylight. Her gear included the disassembled sniper rifle, 3 days of food and water, cold weather survival equipment, and enough ammunition for multiple engagement scenarios. Every item had been carefully selected and tested, but the combined weight felt crushing as Elena navigated loose scree and patches of ice that threatened to send her tumbling into the valley below. Her guide was a local named Dmitri who'd been recruited by intelligence operatives months earlier. He claimed to know these mountains better than anyone, having spent decades smuggling goods across the disputed borders that crisscrossed the region. Elena didn't trust him completely. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but his knowledge of hidden paths and cave systems was proving invaluable as they ascended through terrain that looked impassable on satellite imagery. The weather was already deteriorating as they climbed. What had started as light snow was becoming a steady storm, with wind gusts strong enough to knock Elena off balance when they caught her in exposed sections. Dmitri seemed unbothered by conditions that would have sent experienced climbers retreating to shelter, moving with the confidence of someone who'd navigated these mountains in every possible weather condition. How much farther? Elena asked during a brief rest in the shelter of a rock outcropping. Her breath formed ice crystals in the frigid air, and she could already feel the cold seeping through her insulated clothing. Dmitri consulted a GPS unit that looked older than Elena herself. 2 hours to the cave. Maybe 3 if the storm gets worse. He studied the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read weather patterns as a matter of survival. It will get worse before it gets better. They resumed climbing as the first hint of dawn appeared behind the storm clouds. Elena's legs burned with exhaustion, and the thin mountain air made every breath a conscious effort. But, she'd endured worse conditions during training, and the mission timeline left no room for rest or recovery. The weapon transfer was scheduled to begin in 36 hours, and Elena needed to be in position with enough time to study the target area and calculate firing solutions for multiple scenarios. The cave Dmitri led her to was barely large enough for one person to lie prone, carved into the ridge face by centuries of wind and water erosion. But, it provided perfect concealment and an unobstructed view of the valley where the target facility was located. Elena could see the Soviet-era buildings through her binoculars, a cluster of concrete structures that looked abandoned but were definitely occupied based on the intelligence briefings. Dmitri helped Elena position her equipment before preparing to leave. The plan called for him to return to the valley and establish communications with the recovery team, while Elena remained alone on the ridge for the duration of the mission. "You are sure about this?" Dmitri asked as he prepared to descend. "The storm will be bad. Maybe very bad. And, up here alone." He shrugged, leaving the implications unspoken. Elena was already assembling her rifle, connecting the barrel and receiver with practiced movements that could be performed blindfolded. "I'll be fine. Just make sure you're in position to guide the recovery team when the time comes." Dmitri nodded and disappeared down the mountain, leaving Elena alone with her weapon and her thoughts. The silence after his departure was profound, broken only by the wind howling across the ridge and the steady patter of snow against the rocks around her cave. Elena spent the remainder of the day studying the target facility through her scope, memorizing every detail of the buildings and surrounding terrain. The intelligence briefings had provided accurate floor plans and satellite imagery, but seeing the actual location allowed her to identify firing positions and potential complications that weren't visible from above. The facility consisted of 3 main buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The largest structure appeared to be a laboratory or workshop, with loading bays that would accommodate the trucks intelligence indicated would be used to transport the weapons. The second building looked residential, probably housing for the personnel involved in the transfer. The third was smaller but heavily reinforced, likely a secure storage facility where the weapons were currently being held. Elena's primary target was a man known only as the engineer, the technical specialist responsible for maintaining and deploying the nuclear devices. Intelligence suggested he would oversee the transfer personally, making him the highest value target in the entire operation. Eliminating him would cripple the organization's ability to use the weapons effectively, buying time for diplomatic solutions or conventional military response. The challenge was identifying the engineer among the various personnel moving around the facility. Elena had studied photographs and video footage, but the images were months old and of questionable quality. Her target could be any one of several men she could see through her scope, and she would likely have only seconds to make a positive identification before taking the shot. As evening approached, the storm intensified dramatically. Snow began falling so heavily that Elena could barely see the facility through her scope, and wind gusts reached velocities that would make accurate shooting nearly impossible. She checked her weather monitoring equipment and felt her heart sink. Conditions were trending toward what meteorologists called a whiteout blizzard, with wind speeds approaching 50 miles per hour and visibility reduced to mere yards. Elena had trained for adverse weather shooting, but nothing in her experience compared to the conditions developing around her. The wind alone would push a bullet several feet off course over the distance she'd need to shoot, and that was assuming she could even see her target through the driving snow. She spent the night in her sleeping bag, fully clothed and, with her rifle within arm's reach, listening to the storm rage across the mountains. Sleep came in fragments interrupted by wind gusts strong enough to shake the entire ridge. Several times Elena wondered if the cave itself might collapse under the force of the storm, burying her and ending the mission before it could begin. Dawn of the second day brought no relief from the weather. If anything, conditions had worsened overnight. Elena could no longer see the facility at all through her scope, and radio communications with the command post had become intermittent due to atmospheric interference from the storm. But intelligence updates continued to arrive through encrypted burst transmissions, confirming that the weapon transfer was proceeding on schedule despite the weather. The buyers had arrived during the night, traveling in a convoy of armored vehicles that Elena couldn't see but could occasionally hear over the howling wind. Elena's radio crackled to life with a transmission from Major Patterson at the command post. Overwatch, this is Command. Status report. Command, this is Overwatch. In position but, conditions are deteriorating. Visibility near zero, wind speed 45 to 50 knots. Cannot maintain visual contact with target area. Copy, Overwatch. Be advised, the transfer is confirmed to begin at 1400 hours. Recovery team is moving to secondary positions. You are cleared to engage targets of opportunity as conditions permit. Elena acknowledged the transmission and checked her chronometer. 1400 hours was still 6 hours away, but the storm showed no signs of abating. She began preparing her equipment for what might be the most difficult shot of her career, assuming she could even see her target when the moment came. The rifle required constant attention in the extreme conditions. Elena had to regularly clear snow from the scope lenses and ensure that ice didn't form in the barrel or action. The ammunition was stored in insulated containers to prevent temperature fluctuations that could affect ballistics, but even small changes in powder temperature could influence accuracy over extreme distances. Elena spent the morning calculating firing solutions for various scenarios, factoring in wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, air pressure, temperature, and humidity. The mathematics were complex under ideal conditions, but the constantly changing weather made precise calculations nearly impossible. She would need to rely on instinct and experience when the moment came, making adjustments in real time based on conditions she could observe through her scope. At 1200 hours, Elena received another transmission from Major Patterson. Overwatch, be advised the recovery team is reporting movement at the facility. Multiple vehicles, personnel gathering in the courtyard. This appears to be preliminary activity for the transfer. Elena pressed her eye to her scope and tried to penetrate the wall of snow between her position and the target area. For a moment, she thought she could make out the dim outline of buildings through the storm, but then, the wind shifted and visibility dropped to zero again. Command, this is Overwatch. Cannot maintain visual contact. Conditions remain whiteout with no improvement expected. Copy, Overwatch. Continue to monitor. Recovery team is holding at standby positions pending weather improvement. Elena settled into wait, fighting the cold that seemed to penetrate every layer of her clothing and the fatigue that came from 36 hours of constant vigilance. Her hands were beginning to lose feeling despite insulated gloves, and she had to flex her fingers regularly to maintain the dexterity necessary for precision shooting. At 1330 hours, something changed. Elena couldn't identify what exactly had shifted, but her instincts told her that the moment was approaching. She pressed her eye to the scope and strained to see through the storm, willing the weather to clear just enough to provide a firing opportunity. Then, at exactly 1347 hours, the storm paused. It didn't stop completely, but, for perhaps 60 seconds the wind died down and the snow reduced to a light fall. Elena could suddenly see the facility clearly through her scope, and what she saw made her heart race. The courtyard was full of people and vehicles. She could see men in winter camouflage moving between trucks, and several individuals in civilian clothing who could only be the buyers. And there, directing activity near the largest vehicle, was a tall man with graying hair who matched the photographs of the engineer. Elena's target was 1847 yards away, standing in the open courtyard and apparently issuing instructions to the personnel loading what could only be the nuclear devices into the trucks. He was clearly visible through her scope, a perfect target under impossible conditions. Elena began her shooting sequence, settling into the precise position she'd rehearsed thousands of times. She controlled her breathing, finding the natural respiratory pause that would provide the steadiest platform for the shot. Her finger found the trigger, taking up the slack with practiced precision. But, even as Elena prepared to fire, the storm was reasserting itself. The wind was beginning to pick up again, and she could see snow starting to obscure her view. She had perhaps 30 seconds before conditions would deteriorate beyond the point where accurate shooting would be possible. Elena made her final calculations, estimating wind speed and direction based on the movement of snow and debris she could see through her scope. The mathematics were imperfect, based more on experience and intuition than precise measurement, but they were the best she could manage under the circumstances. The crosshairs settled on the engineer's center mass. Elena took a deep breath, let it out halfway, and held it. Her finger began its final pressure on the trigger, the culmination of years of training and a lifetime of choices that had led to this moment on a frozen mountainside in the middle of a blizzard. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that was immediately swallowed by the howling wind. Elena maintained her position long enough to see the bullet's impact, then began immediately preparing for a follow-up shot in case the first had missed or failed to achieve the desired effect. But, through her scope, Elena could see that no follow-up shot would be necessary. The engineer lay motionless in the snow while chaos erupted around him. Personnel were running in all directions, some seeking cover while others attempted to provide medical assistance. The carefully orchestrated transfer had dissolved into panic and confusion. Elena transmitted immediately to the command post. "Command, this is Overwatch. Target is down. I repeat, primary target is down." Major Patterson's response was immediate and filled with barely controlled excitement. "Outstanding, Overwatch. Recovery team is moving to exploit. Maintain Overwatch and engage additional targets as necessary." Elena settled back behind her rifle, scanning the facility for additional threats. The storm was intensifying again, but the damage had been done. Without the engineer's technical expertise, the weapons would be much more difficult for the buyers to deploy effectively. And, with the transfer interrupted, the recovery team would have an opportunity to secure at least some of the devices before they could be moved to their intended targets. The shot Elena had just made would be analyzed and debated for years by military historians and ballistics experts. The distance, weather conditions, and stakes involved made it one of the most remarkable shots in military history. But, for Elena, crouched in her cave and watching the chaos unfold below, it was simply another mission accomplished. The recovery operation continued for another 4 hours, with Elena providing Overwatch as the specialized team secured the weapons and eliminated remaining threats. By the time the last of the nuclear devices was loaded onto transport helicopters, the storm had reached true blizzard conditions that would have made her original shot completely impossible. As Elena finally began to pack her equipment for the descent from the ridge, she reflected on the narrow margin by which the mission had succeeded. A few more minutes of delay, a slightly stronger wind gust, or a moment's hesitation on her part, and the outcome could have been catastrophically different. The world would never know how close it had come to nuclear terrorism on a scale that could have triggered global conflict. Elena's shot, fired through conditions that should have made accuracy impossible, had prevented a chain of events that could have killed hundreds of thousands and changed the course of human history. But, as Elena prepared to leave the mountain where she'd spent the most intense 48 hours of her life, she understood that the real challenge wasn't behind her. Living with the knowledge of what she'd done, and what she'd prevented, would be a burden she'd carry for the rest of her days. The shot that saved the world had also irrevocably changed the woman who'd made it, in ways that Elena was only beginning to understand. The extraction from the mountain took place under cover of darkness, with Elena being evacuated by helicopter to a secure facility where she underwent immediate debriefing. The process was exhaustive, with intelligence analysts wanting to understand every detail of the shot that had prevented what could have been the worst terrorist attack in human history. Elena found herself reliving those crucial moments over and over, describing wind conditions, visibility, and the split-second decisions that had made success possible. But, even as the analysts praised her marksmanship and decision-making, Elena was struggling with the psychological aftermath of what she'd accomplished. The engineer she'd killed wasn't just a faceless enemy. Through her scope, she'd seen him as a human being, someone with thoughts and fears and, perhaps family waiting for him somewhere. The fact that his death had saved countless lives didn't make the act of killing any easier to process. Major Patterson conducted the final debriefing personally, meeting with Elena in a sterile conference room that could have been anywhere in the world. The mission commander's demeanor was professional but warm, clearly recognizing the psychological strain her subordinate was experiencing. "The shot you made was extraordinary," Patterson began, consulting a thick file of reports and analysis. "Ballistics experts are calling it one of the most difficult confirmed kills in military history. The combination of distance, weather conditions, and time pressure made success statistically improbable." Elena nodded but said nothing. She'd heard similar praise before, after other missions, but this time the words felt hollow. The technical achievement seemed less important than the weight of knowing that her actions had changed the course of world events in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. "The recovery operation secured all 4 nuclear devices," Patterson continued. "The remaining members of the trafficking network have been eliminated or captured. The buyers were taken into custody by local authorities and will face international terrorism charges. By any measure, Operation Silent Thunder was a complete success." "What happens now?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and exposure to the mountain cold. Patterson closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "That depends on you, Sergeant. Your performance on this mission has earned you recognition at the highest levels of government. There are opportunities available that weren't there before, assignments that would make full use of your unique skills." Elena understood the implication. She was being offered entry into the most secretive levels of military and intelligence operations, where her abilities could be applied to problems that regular forces couldn't handle. It was a career path that would provide unlimited challenges and the satisfaction of working on missions that truly mattered, but it was also a path that would take her further from any hope of a normal life. "I need time to think," Elena said finally. Patterson nodded. "Take all the time you need. You've earned it." The debriefing concluded with Elena being granted 60 days of leave, ostensibly for rest and recovery but actually to allow time for the psychological evaluation that would determine her fitness for future high-level assignments. She was flown back to the United States on a military transport, arriving at Andrews Air Force Base on a gray February morning that seemed to mirror her emotional state. Elena's first stop was home, back to Marfa, Texas, for the first time since her deployment to Eastern Europe. The small town looked exactly the same as when she'd left, but Elena felt like she was seeing it through the eyes of a stranger. The concerns of her neighbors, drought conditions affecting cattle ranching, the struggling local economy, disagreements about zoning regulations, seemed impossibly trivial after what she'd experienced in the mountains. Her parents welcomed her warmly, but Elena could see the questions in their eyes. They knew she couldn't discuss her work in detail, but something in her demeanor told them that this homecoming was different from her previous visits. Her mother, Maria, seemed particularly concerned about the hollow look in her daughter's eyes and the way Elena would sometimes stare out the window as if seeing something that wasn't there. "You look tired, Mija," Maria said during Elena's second evening home, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the desert landscape. "More tired than before." Elena wanted to explain, to share the burden of what she'd done and seen, but the classifications and oaths she'd taken made that impossible. How could she tell her mother about the shot that had saved the world? How could she describe the weight of holding human civilization in her hands for those crucial seconds on the mountain? It was a difficult deployment, Elena said finally, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate. Her brother Miguel proved more perceptive, recognizing in Elena the same haunted quality he'd brought home from his own military service. On her 5th day back, he suggested they take a drive out to their grandfather's old ranch, where they'd learned to shoot as children. "Whatever happened over there," Miguel said as they sat in his pickup truck looking out over the empty landscape, "it was big, wasn't it?" Elena nodded, grateful that someone in her family understood without needing explanations she couldn't provide. "The thing about doing something that matters," Miguel continued, "is that it changes you. Makes it hard to care about regular stuff anymore. But, you can't let it consume you, Elena. You've got to find a way to live with it, or it'll eat you alive." Elena spent the remainder of her leave trying to follow her brother's advice, attempting to reconnect with the person she'd been before the mountain. She helped her mother with household projects, accompanied her father to physical therapy appointments, and even went out with some old high school friends who were still living in Marfa. But every social interaction felt forced, like she was performing a role rather than genuinely engaging with people who'd once been important to her. The psychological evaluations began during her final week of leave, conducted by Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a military psychologist who specialized in treating personnel involved in classified operations. Dr. Hendricks had extensive experience working with individuals who participated in missions they couldn't discuss publicly, understanding the unique challenges faced by those who carried secrets that could never be shared. "Tell me about the dreams," Dr. Hendricks said during their third session, having already identified the nightmares that had been plaguing Elena since her return from Eastern Europe. Elena had been reluctant to discuss the recurring dreams that woke her most nights, but Dr. Hendricks had a way of making the psychological exploration feel like mission preparation rather than therapy. "I see the shot over and over," Elena admitted. "But, in the dreams, I miss. The engineer survives, the weapons are deployed, and cities start disappearing. Millions of people die because I couldn't make the shot when it mattered." Dr. Hendricks made notes but didn't interrupt. "The worst part," Elena continued, "is that in the dreams, I know it's my fault. I had one chance to prevent catastrophe, and I failed because I wasn't good enough or strong enough or brave enough." "But, that's not what happened," Dr. Hendricks pointed out gently. "You made the shot. You prevented the catastrophe." "I know that intellectually," Elena replied. "But, emotionally, it feels like I got lucky. Like I succeeded despite my limitations rather than because of my abilities." Dr. Hendricks recognized the psychological pattern Elena was describing. Survivors of high-stakes situations often experienced a form of imposter syndrome, feeling unworthy of the praise they received and haunted by alternative scenarios where they might have failed. The condition was particularly common among individuals who prevented disasters rather than simply responding to them, because the full scope of what they'd accomplished often remained invisible. "The challenge you're facing," Dr. Hendricks explained, "is integrating this experience into your sense of self. You've done something extraordinary, but you can't talk about it with anyone who wasn't there. You've prevented a tragedy of unprecedented scale, but the world doesn't know it happened. That isolation can be more psychologically damaging than the trauma of the event itself." Elena found the sessions with Dr. Hendricks helpful, providing a safe space to process emotions and experiences that couldn't be discussed elsewhere. But the fundamental challenge remained: she was carrying knowledge and responsibility that set her apart from everyone else in her life, creating a barrier that felt increasingly impossible to bridge. The decision about her future came during her final evaluation session. Dr. Hendricks had determined that Elena was psychologically fit for continued service, but had also identified the warning signs of someone approaching emotional burnout. The recommendation would be Elena's choice, but Dr. Hendricks made her professional opinion clear. "You have the skills and temperament for continued work at the highest levels," Dr. Hendricks told her. "But, you're also reaching a point where the psychological costs may begin to outweigh the professional benefits. Another mission like the last one could push you past the point of recovery." Elena had been wrestling with the same conclusion for weeks. The offer from Major Patterson would provide unlimited opportunities to apply her skills to problems that truly mattered, but it would also mean accepting a life defined by secrets and isolation, always carrying knowledge too dangerous to share and responsibilities too heavy for one person to bear. The final factor in Elena's decision came from an unexpected source. During her last night in Marfa, she received a phone call from Dmitri, the guide who'd helped her reach the firing position on the mountain. She'd assumed she would never hear from him again, but somehow he'd managed to contact her through channels she didn't want to examine too closely. "I wanted you to know," Dmitri said in his heavily accented English, "what your shot prevented. The buyers, we learned more about their plans after the arrests. They were not planning single attacks. They had coordinated strikes planned for London, Paris, and New York. The radiation would have made entire city centers uninhabitable for decades. Millions would have died, and millions more would have been displaced. Elena listened in silence as Dmitri continued. My own family lives in London. My daughter, my grandchildren. When I guided you up that mountain, I was thinking about money, about the payment I would receive. But, now I understand that I was helping to save my family, and families I will never meet. What you did mattered more than you know. The phone call ended without Elena saying much in response, but Dmitri's words provided the perspective she'd been missing. Her shot hadn't just prevented an abstract catastrophe, it had saved specific people with names and faces and futures that would now unfold because of her actions on that frozen mountainside. Elena made her decision that night. She would accept one more assignment, a teaching position at the advanced sniper school where she'd been trained years earlier. The role would allow her to pass on the skills and knowledge she'd developed to the next generation of specialists, preparing them for missions she hoped they'd never have to undertake. It would be a way of serving without carrying the full burden of operational responsibility, a path that would let her contribute to national security while maintaining some connection to a normal life. Major Patterson accepted Elena's decision without argument, understanding the psychological toll that missions like Operation Silent Thunder extracted from even the most capable personnel. Elena's final official act was writing a detailed after-action report that would become required reading for advanced marksmanship courses, though the most sensitive details would remain classified for decades. The report concluded with Elena's personal assessment of the factors that had made success possible. The shot was technically difficult but not impossible. What made the difference was preparation, training, and the understanding that failure was not an option. But, most importantly, success required accepting that some responsibilities are too important to avoid, even when the personal cost of accepting them is profound. The hardest part of being a sniper isn't making the shot, it's living with the knowledge of what that shot accomplished, and what would have happened if you had missed. Elena's transition to instructor began in the fall of 2019. She found teaching to be both challenging and rewarding, working with students who possessed the raw talent and determination necessary for specialized operations. But, she was careful to ensure that her students understood not just the technical aspects of marksmanship, but also the psychological preparation necessary for missions where the stakes extended far beyond personal survival. The classified nature of Operation Silent Thunder meant that Elena couldn't share the specifics of her most important shot with her students, but she could prepare them for the moment when they might face similar challenges. Her curriculum included extensive psychological training, focusing on decision-making under extreme pressure and the mental discipline necessary to function effectively when the margin for error was non-existent. Elena's students consistently performed at the highest levels, but, more importantly, they demonstrated the psychological resilience necessary for long-term success in specialized operations. Several of her early graduates went on to distinguished careers in special operations, and, while Elena would never know the full details of their missions, she took quiet satisfaction in knowing that she'd helped prepare them for whatever challenges they might face. The nightmares gradually faded as Elena settled into her new role, replaced by a sense of purpose that felt more sustainable than the intensity of operational assignments. She maintained her own skills through regular training and remained available for consultation on particularly difficult missions, but the primary burden of operational responsibility now rested with others. Elena never married or had children, finding it difficult to build intimate relationships with people who couldn't understand the experiences that had shaped her. But, she developed a circle of friends within the military and intelligence community, people who understood the sacrifices required by service at the highest levels. It wasn't the life she'd envisioned as a teenager in Marfa, but it was a life that provided meaning and purpose while allowing her to sleep most nights without seeing cities disappearing in nuclear fire. The full story of Operation Silent Thunder remained classified, known only to the participants and a handful of officials who needed to understand the precedent it had established. Elena's shot was analyzed and studied, but always within the closed circles of people cleared to know about missions that officially never happened. But, sometimes, late at night when Elena couldn't sleep, she would stand outside her quarters and look up at the stars visible above the training facility. In those quiet moments, she would think about the millions of people who were alive because of a shot fired during a blizzard on a distant mountain, people who would never know how close they'd come to annihilation or who had saved them. The weight of that knowledge would never fully leave her, but Elena had learned to carry it without being crushed by it. She'd found a way to live with the understanding that she'd once held the fate of human civilization in her hands, and, that when the moment came, she hadn't hesitated to pull the trigger. That, perhaps, was the most important lesson Elena taught her students, not just how to make impossible shots under impossible conditions, but how to live with the consequences of success when success meant carrying secrets too important to share and too heavy for one person to bear alone. In the end, that might have been the most valuable skill of all.